Maybe I shouldn't have started another one because I have to pee. There's like no bathrooms out here though. If I have to pee, I have to go into the lake that's behind me and pee in the lake. Oh God, why would he say that? Oh God. He told me that torturing Sam Cortland was the most fun he ever had. I can't. I'm not gonna be able to stop thinking about that. Oh my God. It all came back to me. I miss Sam so much. I miss Sam so much. I miss him so much. Okay. Chapter 52. Let's get it. Let's get it. Cale watched... Yeah, chapter 52, sorry. Cale watched blood bubble out of Archer's lips as Selena let him slump to the stone floor. She stared down at the body, her final words to him hovering in the air, running claws over Cale's already chilled skin. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back as she took a long breath, as if she were embracing the death before her, and the stain it left as payment for her vengeance. He had arrived in time to hear Archer beg for his life, and utter the words that had been his last mistake. Cale shifted his boot against the step to warn her that he was there. How much of her face senses did she retain when she looked like a human? Archer's blood spread across the dark stones, and Selena opened her eyes as she slowly turned to Cale. The blood had soaked the ends of her hair, turning them a brilliant red, and her eyes. There was nothing there, as though she'd been hollowed out. For a heartbeat, he wondered if she would kill him too, just for being there, for seeing the dark truth of her. She blinked, and the killing calm in her eyes vanished, replaced only by bone-deep weariness and sorrow. An invisible burden that he couldn't begin to imagine made her shoulders slump. She picked up the black book that Archer had dropped on the damp stones, but let it dangle from her fingers as if it were a piece of dirty clothing. "I owe you an explanation," was all she said. Selena refused to let the healer look at her until Fleetfoot's leg had been fixed. It was only a long scratch, but it was deep. Selena had held Fleetfoot's head in her arms as the thrashing dog was forced to swallow water laced with a sedative. Dorian helped as best he could while the healer worked on the dog lying unconscious on Selena's dining room table. Cale leaned against the wall of the room, arms crossed over his chest. He'd said nothing to Dorian since they'd gone down into the passageway. The young, brown-haired healer didn't ask any questions either. Once Fleetfoot was patched up and moved to Selena's bed, Dorian insisted Selena get her head looked at. But Selena waved him off and told the healer that if she didn't inspect the Crown Prince first, she'd report her to the king. Scowling, Dorian let the young woman clean the small wound on his temple, received when Selena had knocked him out cold. Considering how bloody Selena and Cale were, he felt utterly ridiculous, even if his head still pounded. The healer finished with him, giving him a timid, slightly concerned smile. And when it was time to decide who should be looked at next, the glaring contest between Cale and Selena was one for the ages. At last, Cale just shook his head and slumped into the seat that Dorian had recently vacated. He had blood everywhere, and ended up peeling off his tunic and shirt so the healer could cleanse his minor wounds. Despite the scratches and cuts, the abrasions on his hand and knees, the healer still asked no questions, her pretty face an unreadable professional mask. Selena turned to Dorian, her voice quiet. "I'll come to your rooms when I'm done here." From the corner of his eye, he sensed Cale stiffening, and Dorian bit down on his surge of jealousy as he realized he was being dismissed. The captain was making a good show of not looking at them. What had happened during the time he'd blacked out, and what had happened when she'd gone to kill Archer. "Fine," Dorian said, and thanked the healer for her help. At least he had time now to piece himself together, to sort through all that had happened in the last few hours, and to plan how to explain his magic to Cale. But even as he walked out of the dining room, part of him realized that his magic, that he was the least of their concerns, because even from the first day in Enderveer, this had always been about them. Selena didn't need a healer to look at her head. When the magic had taken her over, it had somehow healed everything. All that was left of her wounds were bloodstains and torn clothing, and exhaustion, utter exhaustion. "I'm taking a bath," she told Cale, who still sat shirtless under the healer's ministrations. She needed to wash Archer's blood off of her. She shucked off her clothing and bathed, scrubbing herself until her skin hurt, washing her hair twice. Once she emerged, she slipped into a clean tunic and pants, and just as she finished combing out her dripping hair, Cale walked into her bedroom and sat at the chair before her desk. The healer gone. He'd put his shirt back on, and she could see the white bandages peeking through the rips in the dark cloth. Selena checked on Fleetfoot, who was still unconscious, on the bed, and then walked to the balcony doors. She studied the night sky for a long moment, seeking out a familiar constellation, the stag, the lord of the north. She took a long breath. "My great-grandmother was a fae," she said, "and even though my mother couldn't switch into an animal form the way the fae can, I somehow inherited the ability to shift between my fae form and my human form." "And you can't shift anymore?" She looked over her shoulder at him. "When magic stopped 10 years ago, I lost my ability. It's what saved my life, I think. As a child, when I was scared or upset or had tantrums, I couldn't control the shift. I was learning to master it, but I would have given myself away at some point. But in that other world, you could..." She turned to face him, seeing the haunted gleam in his eyes. "Yes, in that world, magic, or something like it, still exists. And it is just as awful and overwhelming as I remembered." She eased onto the edge of her bed, the distance between them feeling like leagues. "I had no control over it, over the shift, or the magic, or myself. I was as likely to hurt you as I was to hurt that creature." She closed her eyes, her hands shaking a bit. "So you did open a portal to another world. How?" "All those books I've been reading on the word marks, they had spells to open temporary portals." And then she explained about finding the passage on Samhain and the tomb and Elena's command to become the champion, and what Cain had been doing, and how she had killed the Ritterak, and how tonight she had wanted to open a portal to see Nehemiah. She left out the word keys, the king, and what she suspected he might be doing with Kaltain and Roland. When she finished, Cale said, "I would say you're insane, except I have the blood of that creature on me and went into that world myself. If anyone knew, not just about the spell to open the portals, but about what I am," she said wearily, "you understand that I would be executed." His eyes flashed. "I'm not going to tell anyone. I swear it." She bit her lip, nodding, and walked back to the window. "Archer told me that he was the one who had Nehemiah assassinated, because she was a threat to his control over the group. He posed as Councilman Mollison and hired Grave. He kidnapped you to lure me away. He planted that anonymous threat against her life, too, because he wanted me to blame you for her death." Cale swore, but she kept gazing out the window, kept looking at that constellation. "Fuck, I lost my spot." "But even though I know you're not responsible," she said softly, "I still..." She found his face full of anguish. "You still can't trust me," he finished. She nodded. In this, she knew Archer had won, and hated him for it. "When I look at you," she whispered, "all I want to do is touch you. But what happened that night, I don't know if I can ever forget it." The deepest cut on his cheek had scabbed, and she knew it would scar. "For my part, I'm sorry for what I did to you." He stood, wincing at his wounds, and walked over to her. "We both made mistakes," he said, in that voice that made her heart stumble. She found the nerve to turn to him, gazing up into his face. "How can you still look at me like that when you know what I truly am?" His fingers grazed her cheeks, warming her chilled skin. "Fae, assassin, no matter what you are, don't..." She stepped back. "Don't say it." She couldn't give him everything again, not now. It wouldn't be fair to either of them. Even if she ever learned to forgive him for picking the king over Nehemiah, her journey to find the word keys would require her to go far away, to a place where she would never ask him to follow. "I need to prepare Archer's body to present to the king," She got out. Before he could say anything else, she picked up Damaris from where she dropped it by the door and vanished into the passage. She waited until she was deep inside before she let the tears start flowing. Damn. Cale stared at where she had gone and wondered if he should follow her into that ancient darkness. But he thought of all that she'd told him, all the secrets she'd revealed, and knew he needed time to comprehend it all. He could tell that she left out information. She told him only the vaguest details, and then there was the matter of her Fae heritage. He'd never heard of anyone inheriting their powers in such a throwback way, but then again, no one spoke of the Fae nowadays. It explained how she knew the ancient dirges. With a gentle pat on Fleetfoot's head, he left the room. The halls were empty and silent. And Dorian, she had acted like Dorian had some power too. There had been the moment when the creature was blasted away by an invisible wall, but it was impossible for Dorian to have power. How could he, when Selena's own magic had disappeared as soon as she returned to this world? Selena was Fae, and heir to a power she couldn't control, even if she couldn't shift, if anyone ever discovered what she was. It explained why she was so terrified of the king, why she never said anything about where she'd come from, or what she'd been through. And living here, this was the most dangerous place for her, or any Fae, to be. If someone found out what she was, they could use that information against her, or have her killed, and there would be nothing he could do to save her. No lie he could tell, no strings he could pull. How long before someone else went digging into her past? How long before someone decided to go right to Arabin Hamel and torture him for the truth? I want him to think about what the fuck he just said. Torture Arabin Hamel for the truth. Cale's feet knew where he was going long before he'd made the choice, formed the plan. Minutes later, he found himself knocking on a wooden door. His father's eyes were bleary with sleep, and they narrowed as they saw him. "Do you know what time it is?" He didn't, and he didn't care. Cale shouldered his way into the room and shut the door, scanning the dimness for any other people. "I have a favor to ask you. But before I do, promise you won't ask any questions." His father gave him a slightly bemused look, then crossed his arms. "No questions. Make your request." Beyond the window, the sky was beginning to lighten into a softer shade of black. "I think that we should send the King's Champion to Wendelin to dispatch the royal family." "What?" His father's brows rose. Cale went on. "We've been at war with them for 2 years, and have yet to break past their naval defenses. But if the king and his son are eliminated, we might stand a chance of getting through in the ensuing chaos, especially if the King's Champion also gets her hands on their naval defense plans." He took a breath, keeping his voice disinterested. "I want to present the idea to the king this morning, and I want you to support me, because Dorian would never agree to it, not without knowing what Selena was, and Cale would never tell anyone, Dorian included. But with an idea this drastic, he'd need as much political muscle as he could get." "An ambitious, ruthless plan," his father smiled. "And if I support this idea and convince my allies on the council to support it too, then what can I expect in return?" From the way his eyes gleamed, his father already knew the answer. "Then I'll go back to Anil with you," Cale said. "I'll leave my position as captain and return home." It wasn't his home, not anymore. But if it meant getting Selena out of the country, Wendelin was the last stronghold of the Fae, and the one place in Aurelia where she'd truly be safe. Whatever shred of hope he'd had for a future with her was gone. She still felt something for him, she admitted, but she would never trust him. She would always hate him for what he'd done. But he could do this for her, even if he never saw her again, even if she abandoned her duties as King's Champion and stayed with the Fae in Wendelin forever, as long as he knew that she was safe, that no one could hurt her. He'd sell his soul again and again for that. Stop. His father's eyes gleamed with triumph. Consider it done. Yeah. Yeah. Chapter 53. When Selena finished telling Dorian the story she'd told Cale, albeit a much more limited version, he let out a long sigh and fell back onto his bed. Sounds like something out of a book, he said, staring at the ceiling. She sat down on the other side of the bed. Believe me, I thought I was going mad for a while. So you actually opened a portal to another world, using these word marks? She nodded. You also knocked that creature aside like it was a leaf caught in wind. Oh, she hadn't forgotten about that. Not for one moment had she forgotten what it meant for him to have such a raw power. That was dumb luck. She watched him, this kind, clever prince of hers. I still can't control it. In the tomb, she said, there's someone who might offer you some advice on how to control it, who might have some information about the kind of power you've inherited. Right then, though, she didn't exactly know how to explain Mort to him, so she just said, someday soon, you and I could go down there and meet him. You'll see when we get there. If he deigns to speak to you, it might take a while for him to decide he likes you. After a moment, Dorian reached over and took her hand, bringing it to his lips for a swift kiss. Nothing romantic. A gesture of thanks. Even though things are different between us now, I meant what I said after the duel with Cain. I will always be grateful that you came into my life. Her throat tightened and squeezed his hand. Nehemiah had dreamed of a court that could change the world, a court where loyalty and honor were more valued than blind obedience and power. The day Nehemiah had died, Selena had thought the dream of the court forever vanished. But looking at Dorian as he smiled at her, this prince was smart and thoughtful and kind, who inspired good men like Cale to serve him. Selena wondered if Nehemiah's impossible, desperate dream of that court might yet come to pass. The real question now was whether his father knew what a threat his son posed. The king of Ardalan had to give the captain credit. The plan was ruthless and bold, and would send a message not just to Wendelin, but to all their enemies. With the embargo between their countries, Wendelin refused to let Ardlanian men into its borders, but women and children seeking refuge could still enter. It made sending anyone else impossible, but his champion. The king looked down his council table, where the captain was waiting for his decision. Westfall's father and 4 others had immediately supported the idea, another bit of unexpected cunning from the captain. He'd brought allies to this meeting. Dorian, however, was watching the captain with barely concealed surprise. Clearly, Westfall hadn't thought Dorian would support his decision. If only Westfall had been his heir instead. His warrior's mind was sharp, and he didn't balk from doing what needed to be done. The prince had yet to learn that kind of ruthlessness. Getting the assassin away from his son would be an unexpected benefit. He trusted the girl to do his dirty work, but he didn't want her around Dorian. She'd brought Archer's Finn's head to him this morning, not a day later than she'd promised, and explained that what she discovered, that Archer had been responsible for Nehemiah's assassination due to their mutual involvement in that traitorous society. He wasn't surprised that Nehemiah was involved. But what would the assassin have to say about this journey? "Summon my champion," he said. In the ensuing silence, the council members murmured to each other, and his son tried to catch Westfall's eye, but the captain avoided looking at the prince. The king smiled slightly, twisting the black ring on his finger. A pity Parrington wasn't here to see this. He was off dealing with the slave uprising in Calicula, news of which had been kept so secret that even the messengers had forfeited their lives. The Duke would have been greatly amused by today's turn of events, but he wished Parrington here for more important reasons, too. To help him find who had opened a portal last night. He'd sensed it in his sleep, a sudden shift in the world. It was open for only a few minutes before someone closed it again. Cain was gone. Who else in this castle possessed that kind of knowledge, or that power in the blood? Was it the same person who had killed Baba Yellowlegs? He put a hand on Nathang, his sword. There had been no body, but he didn't think for one moment that Yellowlegs had just disappeared. The morning after she'd vanished, he'd gone to the carnival himself to look at the ruined wagon. He'd seen the flecks of dark blood staining the wooden floor. Yellowlegs had been a queen among her people, one of the 3 brutal factions that had destroyed the Crochan family 500 years ago. They'd relished erasing much of the wisdom of the Crochan women who had ruled justly for 1,000 years. He'd invited the carnival here to meet with her, to purchase a few of her mirrors, and learned what remained of the Iron Teeth allegiance that had once been strong enough to rip apart the Witch Kingdom. But before she had yielded any decent information, she had died, and it frustrated him to not know why. Her blood had been spilled at his castle. Others might come to demand answers in retribution. If they came, he would be ready. Because in the shadows of the Farian Gap, he'd been breeding new mounts for his gathering armies, and his wyverns still needed riders. The doors to the council room opened. The assassin walked in, shoulders thrown back in that insufferable way of hers. She coolly took in the details of the room before stopping a few feet away from the table and bowing low. "Your Majesty summoned me?" She kept her eyes averted, as she usually did, except for that delightful day when she'd come in and practically flayed Mollison alive. Part of him wished he didn't now have to free the sniveling councilmen from the dungeons. "Your companion, Captain Westfall, has come up with a rather unusual idea," the king said, and waved a hand at Kale. "Why don't you explain, Captain?" The captain twisted in his chair, then rose to his feet to face her. "I've suggested that we send you to Wendelin to dispatch the king and his heir. While you are there, you will also seize their naval and military defense plans, so that once the country is in chaos, we will be able to navigate their impenetrable barrier reefs and take the country for ourselves." The assassin looked at him for a long moment, and the king noticed that his son had gone very, very still. Then she smiled, a cruel, twisted thing. It would be an honor to serve the crown in such a way. He had never learned anything about the mark that had glowed on her head during the duel. The word mark was impossible to decipher. It either meant nameless or unnamed, or something akin to anonymous. But God's blessed or not, from the wicked grin on her face, the king knew she'd enjoy this task. "Perhaps we'll find some fun with it," the king mused. "Wendelin is having their solstice ball in a few months. What a message it would send if the king and his son were to meet their end right under the noses of their own court, on their day of triumph." Though the captain shifted on his feet at the sudden change of plans, the assassin smiled at him again, dark glee written all over her. What hellhole had she come from to find delight in such things? "A brilliant idea, Your Majesty." "It's done then," the king said, and they all looked at him. "You'll leave tomorrow." "But," his son interrupted, "surely she needs some time to study Wendelin, to learn its ways, and it's a 2-week journey by sea," he said. "And then she'll need time to infiltrate the castle in time for the ball. She can take whatever materials she needs and study them on board. Her brows had lightly lifted. Lifted slightly, but she just bowed her head. The captain was still standing, stiffer than usual, and his son was glaring at him and at the captain, so angry that he wondered whether he'd snap. But the king wasn't particularly interested in their petty dramas, not when this brilliant plan had arisen. He'd have to send riders immediately to the Farian Gap and the Dead Islands, and have General Narok ready his legion. He didn't mean to make mistakes with this one chance in Wendelin, and it would be the perfect opportunity to test a few of the weapons he'd been forging in secret all these years. Scary, scary. Tomorrow. She was leaving tomorrow, and Kale had come up with the idea? But why? She wanted to demand answers, wanted to know what he was thinking when he'd come up with this plan. She'd never told him the truth about the king's threats, that he would execute Kale if she didn't return from a mission if she failed. And she could fake the deaths of petty lords and merchants, but not the king and crown prince of Wendelin. Not in 1,000 lifetimes could she find a way out of it. She paced and paced, knowing Kale wouldn't be back in his rooms yet, and wound up going down to the tomb, if only to give herself something to do. She expected Mort to lecture her about the portal, which he did, thoroughly, but she didn't expect to find Elena waiting for her inside the tomb. "You have enough power to appear to me now, but you couldn't help close the portal last night?" She took one look at the queen's frown and began pacing again. "I could not," Elena said. "Even now, this visit is draining me faster than it should." Selena scowled at her. "I can't go to Wendelin. I can't go. Kale knows what I'm doing for you, so why would he make me go there?" "Take a breath," Elena said softly. Selena glared at her. "This ruins your plans, too. If I'm in Wendelin, then I can't deal with the word keys and the king. And even if I pretended to go and instead went questing across this continent, it wouldn't take long for the king to realize I'm not where I'm supposed to be." Elena crossed her arms. "If you are in Wendelin, then you will be near Dornell. I think that's why the captain wants you to go." Selena barked a laugh. Oh, what a tangled mess he'd gotten her into. He wants me to go hide with the Fae and never come back to Ardalan? That's not going to happen. Not only will he be killed, but the word keys. You will sail to Wendelin tomorrow. Elena's eyes glowed bright. Leave the word keys and the king for now. Go to Wendelin and do what needs to be done. Did you plant this idea in his head somehow? No. The captain is trying to save you the only way he knows how. Selena shook her head, looking at the sunlight pouring into the tomb from the shaft above. Will you ever stop giving me commands? Elena let out a soft laugh. When you stop running from your past, I will. Selena rolled her eyes, then let her shoulders droop. A shard of memory sliced through her. When I spoke to Nehemiah, she mentioned that she knew her own fate, that she had embraced it, that it would set things in motion. Do you think she somehow manipulated Archer into... But she couldn't finish saying it, couldn't let herself voice what the horrible truth might be, that Nehemiah had engineered her own death, knowing that she might change the world, change Selena more through dying than living. A cold, slender hand grasped hers. Cast that thought into the far reaches of your mind. Knowing the truth, whatever it may be, will not change what you must do tomorrow, where you must go. And even though Selena knew the truth in that moment, knew it just from Elena's refusal to answer at all, she did as the Queen commanded. There would be other moments, other times to take out that truth, to examine every dark and unforgiving facet. But right now, Selena studied the light pouring in through the tomb, such little light, holding the darkness at bay. Wendelin, then. Elena smiled grimly and squeezed her hand. Well, Wendelin, then. Chapter 54. When the council meeting was over, Cale did his best not to look at his father, who had been watching him so carefully while he denounced his plans to the king, or at Dorian, whose sense of betrayal rippled off of him as the meeting went on. He tried to hurry back to the barracks, but he wasn't at all surprised when a hand clapped on his shoulder and turned him around. Wendelin? Dorian snarled. Cale kept his face blank. If she's capable of opening a portal like she did last night, then I think she needs to get out of the castle for a while. For all of our sakes. Dorian couldn't know the truth. She'll never forgive you for having her shipped off like that, to take down a whole country, and in such a public way, making a spectacle out of it. Are you mad? I don't need her forgiveness, and I don't want to worry about her letting in a horde of otherworldly creatures just because she's missing her friend. He hated each lie that came out of his mouth, but Dorian drank them up, his eyes seeming to glow with rage. This was the other sacrifice he'd have to make, because if Dorian didn't hate him, if he didn't want Cale gone, then leaving for Anil would be that much more difficult. If anything happens to her and Wendelin, Dorian growled, refusing to back down, I'll make you regret the day you were born. If anything happened to her, Cale was fairly certain he'd forever regret that day too. But he just said, one of us has to start leading, Dorian, and stalked off. Dorian didn't follow him. Dawn was just breaking as Selena arrived at Nehemiah's grave. The last of the winter snows had melted, leaving the world barren and brown, waiting for spring. In a few hours, she'd set sail across the ocean. Selena dropped to her knees on the damp ground and bowed her head before the grave. Then she said the words she'd wanted to say to Nehemiah last night, the words that she should have said from the beginning, words that wouldn't change, no matter what she learned about Nehemiah's death. I want you to know, she whispered to the wind, to the earth, to the body far beneath her, that you were right. You were right. I'm a coward, and I've been running for so long that I've forgotten what it is to stand and fight. She bowed deeper, putting her forehead against the dirt. But I promise, she breathed into the soil, I promise that I will stop him. I promise that I will never forgive, never forget what they did to you. I promise that I'll free Ilwi. I promise that I will see your father's crown restored. I'm just going to read that part again because I don't know if I got it or not. But I promise, she breathed into the soil, I promise that I will stop him. I promise that I will never forgive, never forget what they did to you. I promise that I will free Ilwi. I promise that I will see your father's crown restored to his head. She raised herself, drawing a dagger from her pocket, and sliced a line across her left palm. Blood welled, ruby bright against the golden dawn, sliding down the side of her hand before she pressed her palm to the earth. "I promise," she whispered again. "On my name, on my life, even if it takes until my last breath, I promise I will see Eelwe freed." She let her blood soak into the ground, willing it to carry the words of her oath to the other world where Nehemiah was safe at last. From now on, there would be no other oaths but this, no other contracts, no other obligations. Never forgive, never forget. She didn't know how she would do it, or how long it would take, but she would see it through. Because Nehemiah couldn't. Because it was time. Damn. The shattered lock on Selena's bedroom door still wasn't fixed by the time Dorian appeared after breakfast, a stack of books in his arms. She stood before the bed, stuffing clothing into a large leather satchel. Fleetfoot was the first to acknowledge him, though he had no doubt Selena heard him coming from the hallway. The dog limped to him, tail wagging, and Dorian set the books on the desk before kneeling on the plush rug. He ran his hands over Fleetfoot's head, letting her lick him a few times. "The healer said her leg's going to be fine," Selena said, still focused on her satchel. Her left hand was bandaged, a wound he hadn't noticed last night. "She just left a few minutes ago." "Good," Dorian said, rising to his feet. She was wearing a heavy tunic and pants and a thick cloak. Her brown boots were sturdy and sensible, far more subdued than her usual attire. "Traveling clothes. Were you going to leave without saying goodbye?" "I thought it would be easier this way," she said. In 2 hours, she would sail to Wendelin, the land of myths and monsters, a kingdom of dreams and nightmares made flesh. Dorian approached her. "This plan is madness. You don't have to go. We can convince my father to do something else. If they catch you in Wendelin, they won't catch me. There will be no help for you," Dorian said, putting a hand on the satchel. "If you're captured, if you're hurt, you're beyond our reach. You'll be entirely on your own. I'll be fine. But I won't be. Every day that you're there, I'll wonder what has become of you. I won't forget you. Not for 1 hour." Her throat bobbed, the only sign of emotion she allowed to show, and she looked toward her dog, watching them from the rug. "Will you?" He watched her swallow again before meeting his gaze. The gold in her eyes glowed in the morning sun. "Will you look after her while I'm gone?" He took her hand, squeezing. "As if she's one of my own. I'll even let her sleep in my bed." She gave him a small smile, and he had a feeling that any greater sign of emotion would shatter her self-control. He waved a hand to the books he'd brought. "I hope you don't mind, but I need a place to store these, and your rooms might be safer than mine." She glanced at the desk, but to his relief didn't go to it. The books he'd brought would only lead to more questions. I can't say that word anymore. Royal Chronicles, anything on how and why he might have magic. "Of course," was all she said. "I think the Walking Dead is still floating around in here anyway. Maybe it'll be glad to have some company." He might have smiled had it not been eerily true. "I'll leave you to your packing. I have a council meeting at the same time your ship departs," he said, fighting the ache in his chest. It was a lie, and a bad one, but he didn't want to be at the docks, not when he knew someone else would be there to see her off. "So, I suppose this is goodbye." He didn't know whether he was allowed to embrace her anymore, so he stuffed his hands into his pockets and gave her a smile. "Take care of yourself." A faint nod. They were friends now, and he knew that the physical boundaries between them had been altered, but he turned away rather than let her see the disappointment he knew was all too clear on his face. He took all of 2 steps toward the door before she spoke. The word soft and strained. "Thank you for all that you've done for me, Dorian. Thank you for being my friend, for not being like the others." He paused, turning to face her. She kept her chin high, but her eyes were gleaming. "I'll come back," she said quietly. "I'll come back for you." And he knew that there was more that she wasn't saying, some bigger meaning behind those words. But Dorian still believed her. I literally love him so much. Genuinely love that man so much. The docks were crowded with sailors and slaves and workers loading and unloading cargo. The day was warm and breezy, the first hint of spring in the air, and the sky was cloudless. A good day for sailing. Selena stood before the ship that would carry her through the first leg of the journey. It would sail to a prearranged location where a ship from Wendelin would meet it to take aboard refugees fleeing the shadow of Ardalan's empire. Most of the women traveling on her ship were already below decks. She shifted the fingers of her bandaged left hand, wincing at the dull pain radiating outward from her palm. She had hardly slept that night, holding Fleetfoot close to her instead. Saying goodbye an hour ago had been like ripping out a piece of her heart, but the dog's leg was still too injured for her to risk the journey to Wendelin. She hadn't wanted to see Cale, hadn't bothered saying goodbye because she had so many questions for him that it was easier not to ask at all. Hadn't he known what an impossible trap he was setting for her now? The ship captain bellowed a 5-minute departure warning. The sailors started scrambling, doubling their efforts to prepare to leave the harbor and set out down the Avery, and then into the great ocean itself. To Wendelin. She swallowed hard. Do what needs to be done, Elena had told her. Did that mean actually killing the royal family of Wendelin or something else? A salty breeze ruffled her hair and she stepped forward, but someone emerged from the shadows of the buildings lining the docks. Wait, Cale said. Selena froze as he walked to her and didn't move even when she found herself looking up into his face. Do you understand why I did this? He asked softly. She nodded but said, I have to return here. No, he said, his eyes flashing. You listen. She had 5 minutes. She could explain it to him now. She couldn't explain it to him now. Couldn't explain that the king would kill him if she didn't return. That knowledge could be fatal to him, and even if he ran away, the king had threatened Nehemiah's family too. But she knew that Cale was trying to protect her, and she couldn't leave him wholly ignorant, because if she did die in Wendelin, if something happened to her... Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. His brows rose, but she didn't give herself a moment to reconsider, to second-guess her decision. As succinctly as she could, she told him about the word keys. She told him about the word gates, and about Baba Yellowlegs. She told him about the papers she'd stashed down in the tomb, the riddle with the locations of the 3 word keys. And then she told him that she knew the king had at least one, and that there was a dead creature sealed beneath the library, and that he should never open the door to the catacombs. Never. And that Roland and Caltaine might be part of some bigger, deadlier plan. And when the horrible truth had been revealed, she unfastened the eye of Elena from her neck and folded it into his palm. Never take it off. It'll protect you from harm. He was shaking his head, his face deathly pale. Selena, I can't. I don't care if you go looking for the keys, but someone has to know about them. Someone other than me. All the proof is in the tomb. Cale grabbed her hand with his free one. Selena, listen, she repeated. If you hadn't convinced the king to send me away, we could have figured them out together. But now... 2 minutes, the sea captain shouted. Cale was just staring at her, such grief and fear in his eyes that speech failed her. And then she did the most reckless thing she'd ever done in her life. She stood on her toes and whispered the words into his ear. The words that would make him understand why it was so important to her, and what it meant when she said she would return, and he would hate her forever for it once he understood. What does that mean? He demanded. She smiled sadly. You'll figure it out. And when you do, she shook her head, knowing she shouldn't say it, but doing it anyway. When you do, I want you to remember that it wouldn't have made any difference to me. It's never made any difference to me when it came to you. I'd still pick you. I'll always pick you. What? Please just tell me what that means. But there was no time, so she shook her head and stepped back. Cale took 1 step toward her, though. 1 step, then he said, I love you. She strangled the sob that built in her throat. I'm sorry, she said, hoping he would remember those words later. Later, when he knew everything. Her legs found the strength to move. She took a breath, and with a final look at Cale, she strode up the gangplank. Taking no notice of those on board, she set down her sack and took up a place by the railing. She looked down at the dock to find Cale still standing by the walkway as it was lifted. The ship's captain called for them to cast off. Sailors scurried. Ropes were untied, tossed, and tied again, and the ship lurched. Her hands clasped the railing so hard they hurt. The ship began moving, and Cale, the man she hated and loved, so much that she could hardly think around him, just stood there, watching her go. The current grabbed the ship, and the city began to diminish. The ocean breeze soon caressed her neck, but she never stopped staring at Cale. She stared toward him until the glass castle was a sparkling speck in the distance. She stared toward him until there was only gleaming ocean around her. She stared toward him until the sun dropped beyond the horizon and a smattering of stars hung overhead. It was only when her eyelids drooped and she swayed on her feet that Selena stopped staring toward Kale. The smell of salt filled her nostrils, so different from the salt of Endivere, and a spirited wind whipped through her hair. With a hiss through her teeth, Selena Sardathian turned her back on Ardalan and sailed toward Sword Wendelin. Chapter 56. Kale didn't understand what she told him. The words were whispered in his ear. It was a date, not even a year attached to it, a month and a day. A date that had passed weeks and weeks ago. It was the day that Selena had left the city, the day she had snapped at Endivere a year before, the day her parents had died. He stayed on the docks long after the ship was out of the harbor, watching its sails become smaller and smaller as he mulled over the date again and again. Why had she told him everything about those word keys, but made this hint so obscure? What could possibly be more important than the horrible truth about the king he served? The word keys, while they terrified him, made sense. They explained so much. The king's great power, his journey that ended with the whole party mysteriously dying, how Cain had become so strong, even the time Kale had looked at Parrington and seen his eyes darken so strangely. But when she told him, had she known what kind of choice she'd left him? And what could he possibly do about it from Anil? Unless he could find a way out of the vow he'd made. He'd never said when he would go to Anil. He could think about that tomorrow. For now. When Kale returned to the castle, he went to her rooms, sorting through the contents of her desk. But there was nothing about that date. He checked the will she'd written, but that had been signed several days after. The silence and emptiness of her chambers threatened to swallow him whole, and he was about to leave when he spotted the stack of books half hidden in the shadows of her desk. Oh my god, I can't say that word. And countless royal chronicles. When had she brought these books here? He hadn't seen them the other night. Was it somehow another clue? Standing before the desk, I have to pee so bad. He pulled out the royal chronicles, all from the past 18 years, and started back one by one. Nothing. I have to pee, y'all. I have to pee. Then came the chronicle from 10 years ago. I have to pee. Sorry, my phone is dying and I have to pee. Everything's just turning to shit. Then came the chronicle from 10 years ago. It was thicker than all the rest, as it should be, given the events that had happened that year. But when he saw what was written about the date she had given, everything froze. This morning, King Orlan Galathinius, his nephew and heir, Ro Galathinius, and Ro's wife, Evelyn, were found assassinated. Orlan was murdered in his bed at the royal palace in Orinth, and Ro and Evelyn were found dead in their beds at their country estate along the river Florine. There is no word yet about the fate of Ro and Evelyn's daughter, Aelin. I was right. I was right. Kale grabbed for the first genealogy book, the one on the bloodlines of the royal houses of Ardalan and Terrasin. Was Selena trying to tell him she knew the truth about what had happened that night? That she might know where the lost princess Aelin was hiding? Is he stupid? Is he dumb in the head? Is he dumb? That she had been there when this all happened. He's stupid. He flipped through the pages, scanning the books he already had, but then he remembered something about the name Evelyn Ashriver. Evelyn had come from Wendelin, had been a princess of the king's court. Hand shaking, he yanked out a book containing Wendelin's royal family tree. On the last page, Aelin Ashriver Galathinius' name was written at the bottom, and above it, her mother Evelyn's. But the family tree traced only the female line. The female, not the male, because 2 spots above Evelyn's name were written Mab, Aelin's great-grandmother. She was one of the 3 Fae sister queens, Maeve, Mora, and Mab. Mab, the youngest, the fairest, who, when she died, had been made into a goddess, known to them now as Deanna, Lady of the Hunt. The memory hit him like a brick to the face. That Yulmus morning when Selena had looked so uncomfortable to be receiving the golden arrow of Deanna, the arrow of Mab. And Cale counted down the family tree, one after another, until my great-grandmother was Faye. Cale had to brace a hand against the desk. No, it couldn't be. He turned back to the chronicle still lying open and turned to the next day. Aelin Galathinius, heir to the throne of Terrasen, died today, or sometime in the night. Before help could reach her deceased parents' estate, the assassin who had missed her the night before returned. Her body has still not been found, though some believe it was thrown into the river behind her parents' house. And that's where Arabin found her, by the river. She'd once said that Arabin had found her half dead and frozen on a riverbank. He was jumping to conclusions. Maybe she merely wanted him to know that she still cared about Terrasen, or there was a poem scribbled at the top of the Ash River family tree, as though some student had dashed it down as a reminder while studying. Ash River eyes, the fairest eyes, from legends old, of brightest blue ringed with gold. Bright blue eyes, ringed with gold. A strangled cry came out of him. How many times had he looked into those eyes? How many times had he seen her avert her gaze, that one bit of proof she couldn't hide, from the king? Selena Sardothian wasn't in league with Aelin Ashriver Galathinius. Selena Sardothian was Aelin Ashriver Galathinius, heir to the throne and rightful queen of Terrasen. Selena was Aelin, the greatest living threat to Ardalan, the one person who could raise an army capable of standing against the king. Now, she was also the one person who knew the secret source of the king's power, and who sought a way to destroy it. And he had just sent her into the arms of her strongest potential allies, to the homeland of her mother, the kingdom of her cousin, and the domain of her aunt, Queen Maeve of the Fae. Selena was the lost queen of Terrasen. Cale sank to his knees. Damn! Oh my god! Wow! She's Aelin! She's Aelin! Okay, but what I don't... Okay, but what I want to know right now... Hold on, let me plug in my phone before my phone dies. Is Cale upset about what he did? Like, is he, like, regretting sending her? I have to be so mad, y'all. Oh my god. Because that boy sank to his knees. And he's over here thinking twice about his life choices. Oh, he's mad about it? So he... Why is he... No, he's happy? Okay. I hope Aelin comes back and tears everything to shreds. Oh my god. I'm so sorry. Oh my god. I'm so sorry. Oh no. I'm so sorry. Oh, I feel awful. Oh, I feel so bad. I'm so sorry. If it's any consolation, it's still a really good thing to read. It's still a really good series to read. I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's still good because that's the spoiler that I had found whenever I looked up the fan art of Sam. I read that. I just read it really quick. I didn't read her last name. So when I was looking up Sam's fan art, I saw like a little biopic of him, and I like read the first title, and it was like former boyfriend of Aelin, and then I kept scrolling and I was like, who the fuck is Aelin? So when they said Aelin in the book, I was like, oh, is that her? And then they said her last name, and I was like, well, her last name doesn't look familiar. And so I kept going back and forth. I was like, maybe it is her, maybe it's not her, but yeah, it's her. How would you rate this book? I would rate it a good 8 out of 10. the pacing was nice. The sadness was very sad. And the romance was really good. But the Assassin's Blade has still and will be, I think the Assassin's Blade will always be my favorite book from the series. Even when I finish like the rest of them, I feel like it's just going to always be that top one for me. But right now I would rank the Assassin's Blade, Crown of Midnight, Throne of Glass, because those are the only 3 books I've read. The sadness was very sad. Yeah, it was very like depressing, honestly, because it was just there was no up, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. It was all just despair and god damn it. Air of Fire. Okay, what book is next? I just popped my hip. Air of Fire. Okay, Air of Fire is next. I think, haven't I heard that Air of Fire is sad? I love your shirt, B. Thank you. That's my son. Yeah, I thought I had read that Air of Fire was sad. Oh my god. Y'all, I need a buffer because I can't take any more sad. Oh god. See, I got it spoiled that she was Aelin, sort of, but I knew that she was Fae. And I called it, and then everyone gaslit me and was like, she's not Fae, da da da, and I believed it, but I called it that she was Fae. It's emotional, but not like Assassin's Blade said. Okay, y'all, I really want to stay in track, but I have to pee so bad. I'm gonna have to drive to a gas station or something and pee really quick. We will go live on Wednesday, 5:45 p.m. Central Time, because I've been carpooling with my mom to work, and I've been having to pick her up because her car is in the shop. Whatever. So lives will be 5:45 for the extended future. We will start Air of Fire, and we will read Air of Fire, and I hope that it will, not destroy me, but that we'll have fun. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your Sunday, and bye. I will see y'all on Wednesday. Love y'all. Bye.